friends, and now for something completely different. Buffalo, New York. We're in the middle of an epic road trip from Detroit, Michigan through the length of my home state, the Empire State, in the 2016 Chevrolet Camaro. Now, while we work on the full episode, and it's not the usual full first drive episode, it's a first drive episode with like tourist stops along the way, let's you and I go through a tech review of this car, and let's start with the engine because the one behind me here is the SS with a manual transmission. So an interesting aside before we start talking bullets and numbers, this is a very unique launch Chevrolet did here. Normally with these kind of launches, you fly somewhere, you drive the car for 100 or 200 miles, and you give it back after a day. Well, Chevrolet is doing a 6-week road trip, driving these cars, basically circumnavigating the 48 contiguous states of the US. Now, to keep things fair, they basically asked us to pick keys out of a bag of keys. I call it Pete's Bag O' Keys. And I was nervous because I thought I'd get a V6 automatic. Very luckily, we got a bright yellow V8 SS with a manual transmission. So let's go over all of the engines that are on offer here. It starts with, believe it or not, a 4-cylinder turbo. We have not driven that car yet. That car will probably be March when we drive it. But it is a 2-liter turbo. You've seen this in other General Motors cars. In the Camaro, it does 275 horsepower and 295 pound-feet of torque. And 90% of that comes in at 2,100 RPM. So I'm kind of excited to drive that. Then you move up to the V6, the one we kind of know from last year, the 3.6, but there's a number of changes to it. Now it does 335 horsepower, 284 pound-feet of torque, but really interesting for a V6, they're doing the active displacement, so it actually cuts off cylinders to improve the fuel economy. I think that's like one of the first times I've seen that on a V6. Then there's a piece de resistance, this 6.2-liter LT1, 455 horsepower and 455 pound-feet of torque. You're gonna have to come back for the full first drive so we talk about how this thing, and we've done a lot of driving with this, so I've got a little bit more insight here than normal. Now let's press on to the things that affect driving dynamics. Now this is a trend you and I have seen a lot, and that's lowering weight. But what they did here was a little bit different on how they got to lower weight. The goal was to take about 300 pounds off of the last year's Camaro. So the 4-cylinder is about 300 pounds lighter, where this one's about 220 pounds lighter. But how they get there is individual pieces. Like, for example, the body in white itself is lighter. The structural piece for the dashboard is now aluminum. The front suspension pieces are now aluminum. The suspension in the rear, it's still a 5-link unit, but it's Swiss cheese to lower the weight. And then the wheels, they've actually taken weight out of the wheels by shortening the fasteners, but they traded some of that weight away by making the wheels actually wider, so the overall net is a lower weight on the wheel. Then there's the overall size of the vehicle. That's another way how they kind of lowered some weight. So the platform from last year is gone, and what they've done is they've switched this to Dave Leone's ATS platform, so physically the car is now smaller. So that's really the focus of driving dynamics, and you and I are going to spend a lot of time talking about that in the full first drive episode from Detroit all the way to Eastern New York. So we already talked about this being on Dave's ATS platform, so the overall proportions are smaller, but there are a couple of key changes, and let's take a look at them. Number one, you look at obviously the lights, the front and the rear, especially notice the rear, they're kind of scalloped here. They have some depth to them, much like the Corvette does, and obviously that's a function of Tom Peters running design for both the Corvette and this car. But then really, the biggest change in this car, at least to me, is this seat pillar here. Now, if you look at a Gen 5 car, the line basically goes from here all the way to here. Where this, they've picked it up. And actually, I talked with Tom 2 nights ago at dinner, and I asked him, what was the logic in doing that? And he looked at me like, there was no logic. We just wanted to do something different and change the overall look of the greenhouse. And one of the designers was saying, well, the look was supposed to be like wraparound sunglasses. I don't know if I'm seeing wraparound sunglasses here, but for me, this is, I think, one of the more controversial pieces of this design. I love the taillights. I think the front end is very successful, But overall here, this is like the change, at least for me, from the Gen 1 Camaro to the Gen 2 Camaro. This is where I see like the 1970 model year car a bit. And you can, of course, weigh in the comments and tell me what you think here, but this is really one of the more controversial pieces for me. Now, while we're talking about design, let's take a look at the interior. And this is where the dashboard, it still has the general same shape, but the details actually change the entire interior. Like, take a look in here. The actual instrument binnacle has this piece that's recessed in here, and then there's now a screen, but the screen, it's like tilted back to avoid the glare from the sunlight. But then notice, instead of that big, harsh piece of plastic that was on the Gen 5 car, what they've done here is covered it like in a Cadillac, the cut and sew deal. So you actually have a softer piece of material, not plastic that's on the dash. Now, overall, there is a lot of plastic here. I'm sure, now this one's a 1SS, which means it's not the full tilt. It doesn't have everything in it, it doesn't have leather. So I'd love to see a 2SS and see what they do here. I'd love to see like this dressed up with leather and maybe a bit more leather over here. Now there's one little touch I got to show you guys. Come on over here. The vents, these are wild. So to run the HVAC system, instead of just having buttons here, what they've done is minimal buttons for airflow and air conditioning compressor, but the actual fan speed and the temperature is controlled here instead of putting an additional rotary knob here. This, I think, the simplicity of this is genius. Now, this is the overall interior, and notice this one's a manual transmission, and it's got the rev matching paddles. Now, if you look at some of the details, like the switchgear here, even down here, this is very much akin to what we're seeing in the Corvette. So now it's like the family pieces are tied, where the Gen 5 Camaro, a lot of the switchgear was only to the Gen 5 Camaro. Now let's wrap around to the front, and we talked about the lights already, but notice the lower grille. It's quite a bit taller. In my eyes, it's more Ferrari than it is Chevrolet. Now, that's in concert with these extractors that are up here that actually work. These are functional, pull the air out from the engine compartment. So really, in summary, there are two things going on here. There are significant changes going on underneath the skin that give you lighter weight, and in my eyes, there's more pageantry, almost more maturity on the interior of this car than the Gen 5 car. But then the design, you can't mistake it for a Camaro. The general shape is there, but then there are detail changes that definitely say it's an entirely new car. Some I like, some I'm still kind of on the jury on. So I want to leave you guys with this question. What are the things that you like about the 2016 Camaro? And what are the things that you don't like? But also, let me know what you'd want to change. Let me know in the comments below or via our social media, Motoman TV all in word, Motoman TV all in word, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And I want to leave you with two more things. Number one, I got to take my hat off to Chevrolet here, because this was a hell of an idea and quite an undertaking to basically run these cars for 6 weeks around the country. And to really drive a car for 500 miles, you really get to know it. And you can actually follow the progress of these cars at #FindNewRoads. And number two, while we're talking about hashtags and mobile and that kind of stuff, I have an announcement for the show. You can now get us not just on YouTube, Apple iTunes, and all that kind of stuff. You can download us on your Google device, so an Android phone, as well as, I think I have another one here as well, your iOS device. So I'm very proud to announce that we are now live via mobile on Android and iOS.